Alright, so I just spent about an hour and a half watching your history of philosophy timeline and scientific discussions, a response to that, and then your response back to him. So it's all a bit overwhelming, but I'm going to try and weigh in again on the topic of postmodernism. I'm going to primarily take issue with your classification of the history of philosophy as being a story of paradigmatic periods and the transitional periods between them. And I think a big problem is what happens if a group comes along whose paradigm is that there is something wrong with paradigms, whose central idea is that what's been wrong in the past is that people have shared some kind of central idea and worshipped it. So I'd say that the postmodernists aren't just taking issue with the paradigm, with the grand narrative of the modernists. I'd say more so they're taking issue with that whole trend in history for people to come under one grand narrative and see that as objective truth. But I think that kind of misses the point to say that they're just anti having paradigms. I think we have to bring self-referentiality into the discussion, because it's not just that the postmodernists are against having a paradigm, but more so they are aware of the ways in which the accepted truths and the accepted ideas of your time affect how you see the world and what ideas you have about truth and the world. So, I mean, it kind of sounds weird to say, well, they want to get rid of paradigms altogether. Well, more so they just want to be aware of them. So I think that once Thomas Kuhn writes about paradigm shift, once you have that kind of self-awareness, then something fundamentally changes, and you can't really continue to tell a narrative of the history of philosophy in the same way that you used to be able to of, a paradigmatic period, then a disagreement with it, and then a new paradigm arising. Once you describe a dialectic of enlightenment in the way that you did, then something changes. Like that dialectic can't really keep on going the way that it used to, because there's a new ingredient in the formula, and that is your own awareness of the formula itself. As soon as you lay out the dialectic of enlightenment in that way, it's not going to continue in the same way that it used to. It's not going to continue in the way that it used to as just a subject to the forces of history, of paradigm and then critique against it and then a new paradigm. But in a sense, you're going to become a conscious, self-aware agent in that process. It's not just going to be a dumb process of history anymore. It's going to be a self-aware process, and that's quite different. If you take someone like Arthur Danto, for example, argues that art history is over, and it finished the second that Warhol made Brillo boxes, because self-referentiality is kind of the end of the historical journey. As soon as you ask the question in a piece of art, is this art, then the history of art is not going to continue the way that it used to as a story of, what does and doesn't count as art. So, I don't know. I don't want to say that postmodernism is the end of history, but the story of history is going to start to take on a new character, and it's not going to be just a continuation of the old story that you used to be able to tell. Another criticism that I have is that if we were to stick with this idea of paradigmatic periods and transitional periods, what happens if some of the ideas of a transitional period start to be reified? What happens when some of those ideas start to be realized in literature, in art, in culture in general, and in the structure of society in general? Surely then you have to recognize that there are some underlying ideas going on there. It's not just this transitional period where nobody agrees on anything. And maybe this has got something to do with the way that I've studied postmodernism, but rather than starting with the philosophers and seeing if they've got an idea that they have in common, and then going on from there. I'm kind of starting with this idea of what I have of what the postmodern is, of what the postmodern condition is, or postmodern society and culture is. If you have a look at what's underlying the culture, there's definitely a philosophy there. There's definitely ideas there about the fragmentation of truth, about the infinity of meaning, the relativity of meaning, ideas of what is originality, the phenomenon of appropriation and illusion and intertextuality and self-referentiality, as I already mentioned before. And you start putting all of these things together and you start to build up a bit of a philosophy. And then you have a look around and you see that, well, there are actually a lot of philosophers who have been talking about these ideas. And the fact that they don't kind of fit together under a paradigm, the fact that they don't all agree on a grand narrative only seems to serve postmodernism better, because it would be totally contradictory if they did that. So I take the internet to be the quintessential reification of postmodernism. Like, I don't know, just take examples of like Wikipedia. What is the underlying notion of what truth is, of what knowledge is, that belies Wikipedia? Or if you take YouTube as an example, what is the underlying assumption as to what culture is that's at the base of YouTube? And I think those assumptions which underpin the internet are quintessentially postmodern assumptions. So basically, my main objection is that you can't just say postmodernism is a transitional period that was anti-modernism, or anti the paradigm of the modern era, because it's anti the whole story that you told. And I think that we're not just living in a time that's just a scattered jumble of criticisms. I think there is such thing, there's definitely such thing as a postmodern culture, as a postmodern condition, as a postmodern outlook on the world. I think we'd all agree that exists. But I would say that there is a postmodern philosophy which underlies those things. And furthermore, I would say there are a lot of philosophers who point to a lot of those ideas, and while they disagree about a lot of other things, that doesn't preclude us from saying that they are postmodern, those philosophers.